Hey everyone, I just wanted to read you this video for unwrapping since I messed up the last one. I'm not going to go over the modeling bits again. You guys probably know how to model pretty good. If you want me to do any tutorials on that, just let me know. I'm going to show you 3 different techniques for unwrapping with 3 different situations. And then we'll kind of go from there. So the first one I'm going to go over, and I will remodel this part because it's kind of important to the unwrapping idea, is splines. So I like using splines quite a bit. They're in this object over here, the 2D shapes. You can just use lines to draw a line. You can do 90 degrees. You can do cool shapes like this, whatever. By default, you won't be able to see anything. It'll just be a line like this, but you could turn on renderer and then render in viewport. And then you can set up how thick these things are, how wide they are. It's quite nice. By default, they'll be radial as well, so you can have nice round ones like this. You could edit these after the fact. They're all Bezier handles, or whatever handles you want them to be. They're just 2D shapes, much like in Illustrator or in Photoshop or something like that. They're some of my favorite 2D shapes to work with in terms of all the different software. But anyways, they're awesome because they have a bunch of really good tools for doing stuff. Like you have this like really nice fillet option, and you can make these nice round corners and things like that. But my favorite thing about them is they actually auto unwrap themselves, which is great. As long as you have this generate mapping coordinates flag on, they will generate mapping coordinates, and they're really awesome. So I'm going to add a UVW unwrap modifier in here. I have a shortcut for it. I'll show you that in a second. So they actually just do a straight flat unwrap like this. It's very stretchy in the beginning, but you can just scale it down. Right. Let's see. Boop. So nice even squares. I'm just using the checker pattern that comes with 3D Max here to kind of see how these are like. And you can see they're nicely unwrapped in a row there. If you don't have that on, or if you make a complicated shape like this with a 3D objects, like a cylinder or something like that, the unwrap will be probably something like this. And then even if you do like a flat map, it'll do some awfulness like that, and trying to straighten these out and stitch them all together is a huge pain in the butt. So that's why I like splines. They will also do this for the square object as well. The only problem with them is they don't really consider proportions. So if I put this checker on, you see here, that one's there, this one's kind of squished. So you still have to go through and kind of adjust, for the proportions. And kind of eyeball it a little bit, maybe. Right, something like that. I would still have to fix up these a little bit, but it's still most of the way there for you. The caps it won't do very well, so you still have to flat map and attach those ones. But anyways, splines are awesome. I really like them for 2D shapes like that, well, 2D, 3D shapes, Next is some basic geometry. So we have a little pillar here and a little pedestal that I modeled. Cylinders are fun to unwrap in some ways. They're a little easier if this is like a lofted shape that gets perfect everywhere, so it's a little easier. So I add a UVW unwrap. I'm assuming this is what you guys use as well. This one allows you to edit all your UVs here. This one I have already unwrapped. By default, it will probably look like this, or something, some garbage, right, where you first have it. What you want is you want it to look the way I had it before, so let's take a look at how we can do that. So you have a couple options. Number one is using the projection modifiers over here. You'd like to use the cylinder one for cylinders, obviously. I don't know why the pivot's all the way over here. But this way it kind of tries to unwrap it as a cylinder, which is nice. It does a pretty good job. It doesn't do a couple things. You have to click on this to get out of this menu. It doesn't do the tops and the bottoms, the caps here. So if we take a look at this, see here, it didn't do the cap. I deleted this bottom because I didn't really need it for my mesh. So you still have to take this top bit and go to like map, flat map, bring up this little guy here, and then oops, do that. So, you know, he's still there, and then you'll have to adjust the scale and stuff later. It also doesn't do undercuts very well, so it does things at like a 45-degree angle, okay, but you see here, this face is fairly long, but on this, on the UVs, it's very stubby because it did a projection from the side like this. So you'll still have to go through and elongate any areas that it didn't do a good job of kind of keeping the proportions to. Before you do that, there's an issue you're going to have to fix with using projection, which you'll see here, it kind of messed up this area here because these green edges here, it didn't stitch them together for some reason. It does a very poor job of stitching some of this stuff. You're going to have a seam. That's what these green lines means they're a seam. You obviously need a seam somewhere in your mesh because you can't connect this one side to the other side because it's impossible, you know, with in the actual UV editor. You can have it from one side to the other in the textural tile, but that's a different thing. These guys you don't want. So the easiest way to fix those is by selecting your edge select on the bottom here, selecting one of them, just clicking once somewhere, and then go into Tools, Stitch Selected. I have this hotkeyed to a T, and then you can just hit OK. It doesn't really matter what that setting is on for this purpose. And when you have it on a hotkey, you can just hit T spacebar, T spacebar, and I'm going to fix all these green lines here. You could do a weld as well, but I like to use this one just because this is a good tool to learn, so I like showing it because you're going to use it a lot. But you could also select the vertices and weld them. There's different ways of doing it, but so again, Tools, Stitch Selected, and then just hit OK or spacebar. Tool, Stitch Selected, spacebar. Yes, this is time consuming, but the nice thing about this is now when we go into here and we select all of these ones and we move this up, it's not going to create any weird pulling over there. So I'm going to go through and make sure that all my stuff feels pretty good, feels generally into proportion with my model. That's your main goal here with your UVs, is to try and ensure that the general proportions and lengths of things are more or less accurate to the model. You want these squares to be as square as possible, and you want them to be as even as possible. So, you know, something like this is fine. There's only one seam going along here, which is great. If we bring this into Substance or something like that, we'll only have the one seam there. So as long as we kind of place this pillar facing, you know, from here to here facing the camera, nobody will ever see that seam and it'll be just fine. And then your final bit you have to do here is you have to pack this within this square. If you're going to bring it into Substance, it needs to be only within this square. Anything outside of this square is basically using this texture again. So it's going to overlap that texture, which is not something that you want if you're bringing it into Substance. If you're just putting a tileable texture on here, then that's fine, but it really depends on what you're doing. So the easiest way to pack stuff is just to go down here and use one of the arrangement tools, and you just hit that and it'll be fine. You can lower this down a little bit if it lets you. From mine's being weird today and doesn't want to let me do it, but you could manually increase some of the size of these things too. The most important part of this is that it doesn't go outside of this. It actually makes sure it's not too close. Have a pixel or two in between there, depending on how big your texture is. And then make sure your objects do not touch or intersect each other, because then they will overlap UVs and you'll have issues and problems. And if they're too close, you may have problems too, because if this is only like a 128 by 128 pixel texture, you may have a pixel that goes across both of these meshes and then it won't know which colors to add. So the higher the resolution, the smaller these gaps can be, and the lower resolution texture, the bigger those gaps have to be. So if that doesn't make sense to you, let me know. I can do a texturing tutorial as well and kind of go over some of those basics and then some more advanced techniques for using substance and painting. And that's it. Then we have our cylinder. He's all good to go. Then we will do our box. Our box is a little harder in some ways, easier in other ways. So again, unwrap UVW. I have that on a shortcut as well because I use it a lot. This is what you want your box to look like when it's done. When you start, it will most likely look like this or some gibberish in whatever. This is not what you want. If you put your checker pattern on, you'll see here some have no UV space, some have some. It's not great. We can't really use a box projector on this because it'll do a bunch of weird stuff. It's not really great at doing that. Plus it's overlapping elements. Not really a good way to start. For very boxy things, and really for most of the things that I unwrap, I just select all my faces. I'm on face select. I hit Control A. I go to Tools, or Mapping, sorry, and Flat Mapping. And I kind of just leave it on a 45-degree angle. This angle decides what to stitch together in terms of faces. Anything 45 degrees or less will get stitched together. Anything over that will get split apart. You see here, it did a pretty good job. It flattened up all my areas. It kept the proportions nice and cleaned things up. It did a few things that are not desirable, so this part's great. It's just the top. The side bits are pretty good, but you can see here by the green, we have lots of seams, and we have these seams going across here. Because what it did is, this is almost flat. It's, on a very small angle. It's higher than 45-degree angle between this one and this one. So it flattened these guys together, which is not really what we want, right? This is a very thin shape. There's a lot of wasted space here, and we're going to have lots and lots of seams here, so it's not really great for painting that way. Now this is a box, so I'm going to have lots of seams. I can't stitch it all together. But really I want my seams probably on my corners and edges because they'll be less visible that way and they just make the most sense there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch all these sides together so they're nice and clean and smooth and the details there can flow very nicely along. So I'm going to take these little edges here and I'm going to select just my face. I'm going to select one of these faces. I'm going to go to Tools and I'm going to detach edge verts. And what that's going to do is detach this one from the rest of the element. If I try and move this on its own, it's going to take that for a ride. I do not want that, so I'm going to go detach edge verts, and this will separate these out, and I'll show you why that's useful in a second. Next, we're going to take, this is the bottom. I can move this over to the side. I don't need it. This is the top, which is fine. I'm going to take these pieces here. I'm going to make sure my element select is on, so I can just click once and it'll take the whole thing. I won't be dragging things across by accident. And I'm going to move all of these just off to the side here because I'm going to stitch them all together. There we go. And what I want to do is I want to stitch these little pieces onto here. You see when I have this selected, this line appears as blue. It means this face is attached to this object by that blue line. So I'm going to go to my edge select. I'm going to make sure my element is not on, so I can just select an individual edge. And I'm going to do what I did before. I'm going to go to Tool and Stitch Selected. And I'm going to turn this to 0. And that's going to bring that little edge all the way over here. Which I'll show you from over here. If I hit Tool, Stitch Selected, it's going to bring that edge all the way over here. If I don't do align clusters, you'll see it'll just bring the edge, but not the whole shape. Align clusters will bring the whole shape along. And as you're seeing here, that green line is now gone. There's not a seam there anymore. So I'm going to do these two quickly with my shortcut. And then I'm going to do that again for this top bit here. Tool, Stitch Selected, Tool, Stitch Selected. And now you see I have no seams. There's no seams going along here. It's just nice and smooth. I just have edges on the top here and along this box. And I could actually get rid of these too, because if players are seeing the top of this, I might want this to be cleaned up. So I'm going to select these edges one by one and do Tool, Stitch Selected. Same thing. And I'm going to stitch all of those bits over there, and I can even take this one and stitch them onto the bottom of one of these. And now look how very few seams I have on this, and they're nice and tidy, and just on the edge and around these three edges, and that's it. From this angle, it's going to be a very smooth mesh. And then the same thing, I'm going to pack this into my square here. I could do it manually, or I could just use the arrangement tool here. Let's go boop. And that's it, and that box is ready for substance and texturing. There's some more advanced techniques where you can use things called just trim maps, where you already have a texture with some nice trims on them, and you unwrap an object to that trim, which is very nice. I can also teach you that if you're interested. It's a bit more advanced and takes a lot more planning, but can be very useful. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to showcase unwrapping organic objects. We have this blobby rock and this also different blobby rock. These are ugly, don't judge me by my terrible rocks that I threw together. But they're good examples of how to do something that's a bit more blobby. Let's start with the easy one. This one here is just kind of one big blob. Very smooth shapes too. This one has like a big shape that's sticking out the top. When you first make this, it's probably going to look like this here. Just a bunch of flattened textures. And it might look kind of okay when you first look at it. Oops. What are you doing? But the problem with it is you have a bunch of stretching here. There's a lot of faces on top of other faces, which is not very good for texturing. So what I'm going to do, none of the real projections will work very well on this. You see here it's going to do some ugly stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to manually do what's called a pelt, kind of like you would for, like an animal fur or skin like that way back when. You would like stretch it out to make sure it's all, nice and flat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the faces that I want to pelt together. Now, when you first make this box out of whatever, you might have lots of different seams on your object like this here. It might look like this when you first start, and you don't really want these seams. They're going to interfere with your work. So what I like to do at first is I like to hit go to face, hit Control A, select all my faces, and I like to just do a planar map, a projection planar map. And this makes things very ugly, but it gets rid of all the seams on your mesh, so we could just kind of start clean and from the beginning. So I like to do a planar mesh first, or planar projection map first, just to kind of remove all the seams. It's kind of a stupid way of doing it, but it's just my quick little way of going about that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the faces that I would like to be together, or where I'm basically going to do my seam. So I'm going to go in the viewport here, and I could hit F2 to turn this red on if it makes it easier for me. And I'm going to just select all the faces that I think should all be one. And I think this is smooth enough that I could unwrap this all together. Now what I'm going to do is in here, I'm going to go to Tools, and I'm going to detach edge verts again so I can pull this apart. And now I have two separate meshes with one nice seam on the bottom. If this is kind of on the ground, maybe tucked in a little bit, I might edit this mesh a little bit so that edge is flat. That's a good place for a seam for my mesh. And so what am I going to do here? The planar projector is like pretty decent, but then stretches around the side. This bottom one's actually pretty good because it's a very simple flat shape anyways, but it's not perfect. None of the tools I have used so far will work very well on this, but 3D Max has an excellent tool called Quick Peel. They have this pelt map over here, which I don't actually really use. I actually just use the Quick Peel these days because it's really great. Having these faces selected, I'm just going to click this button. And what it's going to do is it's going to do its best to try and preserve the shape and unwrap it nicely so that all the squares are kind of even. And it's going to do its best job to mitigate both problems. It's quite nice. So I'm going to do the same thing for this one. I'm going to select all of these faces together. I'm going to hit Quick Peel. And you'll see here, it did a pretty good job of keeping this all one shape. Doing, there's a little bit of warping and a little bit of size change here. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, I'm back. This pelted pretty nicely together, and this is good enough to start texturing or throwing tileable texture on there. And then if I'm going to bring this into Substance and do a custom texture on this, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pack it together. I can even make a choice to give this bottom bit a little bit less resolution than the top bit if I feel people aren't really going to see that bottom that much. If I'm going to be flipping this rock upside down and using both sides, then I want to keep everything the same resolution just to make sure it's good. Now let's do this rock here. This is going to be the same technique, but it's going to bring up one other problem that you're going to have with this. Sometimes it's not so easy to pick which objects to peel together. So same thing, I'm going to select all my faces and I'm going to just do a planar map to get rid of all my seams, because your seams will probably be crazy like this in the beginning. Oh my god, what is 3D Max doing? Why are you not doing that? So yeah, it might look crazy like this, so I'm just going to do a planar map and get rid of all my seams there, which is great. Now, you may think you could do the same thing over here. I'm going to select all the top bits. Right, and you're like, yeah, this is good. I'm going to go to Tools, Detach Edge Verts. I'm going to do a quick peel here. Now, yes, it did its best job to try and preserve that, but because there's not a lot of seams over here, it really had to stretch out these bits to fit them in together. It's really hard to fit this in all in one piece without, you know, a lot of stretching and things like that. So that's not really good. That's not going to look great. If that's 1 pixel and that's 1 pixel, this is going to be a very blurry top compared to how much detail there's going to be down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to find a place to add some seams, a place for it to relax, kind of like if you had to unfold a t-shirt or you know, pants or something like that. There's going to be seams somewhere because you have to have them somewhere in order to make some of these shapes work. Now what I could do is I could do the same thing I was just doing, where I select the faces manually and then start you know, doing a pelt on that on its own. Or I could use this point-to-point seam tool, which is really cool. I really like this one. It lets you click an edge and then click another edge, and you see that yellow line? That's where it's traveling across to get to my second click. And that's actually making seams for me. I'm going to right-click to stop doing that, and maybe I'll do one over here. And now when we do a quick peel on this guy again, you'll see here it opened up that area. It made seams there, and it fixed a lot of our issues here because it gave it a lot more breathing space for it to you know, unwrap properly. I could even go and connect these if I really wanted to have an extra seam there. Sometimes this is good for packing your meshes after. And it's actually going to make 2 meshes for me. And then I'm going to quick peel this one on the bottom here. And now I have, you know, some seams. Maybe these aren't the best ones. The best seams on a mesh are usually ones that are hidden by geometry or texture detail. So if I had a crack running along this rock over here, I would cut a seam along that rock and make sure that it was kind of hidden within the crevices of some details. So this is not the best seam for it, but it's not, you know, the worst either. If you're kind of using this rock from here to here, it might be a good way to hide some of this stuff. So again, not perfect, but at least it's clean and it'll work. So the same thing, I'm going to pack these guys together. Sometimes this packer doesn't do a great job. You might have to click on rotate and it'll rotate some of your meshes. And it's basically trying to find the most optimal way to put all your pieces into this square while giving them as much room as possible. Sometimes it's not great. Sometimes you can manually do this on your own. The packer used to be really awful, so we used to have to pack all this stuff manually all the time, which was kind of a fun, hypnotic little workflow that I quite enjoyed in my life from time to time, you know. So you gotta just, you know, figure out what's the best situation. Sometimes, you know, you're just kind of doing it a couple pixels at a time and trying to get the most detail out of your mesh, right? Because this is going to be your texture, so if this is a 1024 by 1024, you're going to waste a lot of pixels in here, but you're going to give as much resolution to your mesh as possible. And if you don't think people are going to see this bottom part, you can shrink this a little bit. Not really a great thing to do, but, you know, it depends on your resource needs and whatnot. For you guys, you should probably be fine just keeping them all equal. And now we're ready to unwrap all three types of meshes. We're good for our rocks, our geometric kind of meshes, and our very spline-based meshes. So anyways, I hope that helps. If any of that went over your head, if you know, I went too far into stuff that I thought you guys should know, let me know. I can do a more basic tutorial on just what unwrapping is, how to do any of it. There's lots of tutorials on the internet too, so it's, you know, you don't have to wait for me. I could also do a much more advanced tutorial if you want to see some other techniques. More than happy to do a tutorial on Substance Painter and how to actually paint up some of this stuff and do some of that interesting stuff there. Let me know, just whatever you need, okay? Thank you.